Commander Vex lands on a planet that shouldn't exist and finds it was waiting for him. A forgotten civilization didn't die, it became a question. To help it change, Vex must choose what to forget. He becomes the archive's first new voice. And now, it waits for whoever comes next. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. He came down in fire. Not from battle. Not from sabotage. From choice. The drop pod screamed against the atmosphere of a planet that shouldn't have been there, charted as lifeless, colorless, not even orbitally stable. But now, below him, it bloomed. Not green. Not alive. But structured. Organized. In a way nature didn't grow and civilization didn't build. Commander Ishan Vex braced against the seat, staring through the cracked viewport at the surface spiraling beneath. Massive loops. Not roads. Not cities. Just paths. Worn into the ground, traced by something too large and too old to remember why it walked. The pod slammed into the dirt with a soundless crunch, the atmosphere too thin for thunder, too dry for fire. Gravity held, but not like it should have. Vex coughed. Unstrapped. Let the hatch pop with a hiss of oxidizer and ancient air. His boots touched the ground of a planet that didn't exist in any system 10 days ago. In the moment he stepped out, it felt him. Not visually. Not in motion. In structure. Something deep beneath the crust of this world realigned slightly, as if an equation had been adjusted. As if he had added a variable it had been waiting for. He stood, scanning the horizon. The landscape was a plane of geometric indentations, not quite ruins, not quite architecture. Spirals within spirals. Some stretching kilometers. Others only meters wide. They shimmered faintly in the dusk of a sun that looked manufactured. Behind him, nothing. The ship was gone. That part hadn't been planned. There was supposed to be orbital tether. A failsafe. A signal net. But after the descent, the sky had gone flat, not black. Just inactive. Like the stars had blinked and decided not to come back on. Vex exhaled slowly. He wasn't lost. He was selected. That's what the woman had told him. The one who appeared in his quarters 3 days before launch. No name. No insignia. Just eyes that looked like the last thing before sleep. You're not going there to find anything, she'd said. You're going there to be found. Now, standing here, he understood. The planet wasn't the objective. He was. The ground vibrated. Not an earthquake. A response. From the horizon, a shape emerged. No movement. Just sudden presence. It hadn't walked or flown. It had appeared as if memory itself was capable of rendering objects into the world. It looked like a tower, but not vertical. It sprawled across the horizon like a fallen idea, with surfaces that shimmered and bent the air around them. No seams. No entry points. Only pattern. A tower made not of matter, but of intention. He started walking toward it. Not because he had a plan, but because the alternative was standing still, and this world clearly didn't appreciate inertia. With every step, the landscape subtly adjusted. Not terrain perception. The sky changed color. The ground softened, then hardened. Sounds he couldn't place echoed from no direction. Some organic. Some like pressure fracturing underlanguage. He paused only once, at the edge of a pattern etched into the dust. A symbol. Infinity. But broken. Bent at the curve. Incomplete. He knelt, tracing it with his glove. It didn't resist. But it did watch. Not from above. Not from the structure. From within. The air thickened. And then, a voice. Not from a speaker. Not from the suit. From the ground. It said, calmly, without tone. Do you remember why you were chosen? Vex didn't respond. Because in that moment, something deep in his memory twitched. And a voice, not his own, whispered. Because you were the last one who refused to lie. Because you were the last one who refused to lie. The words weren't his. Not entirely. They came like a half-dream, not remembered, but reconstructed. The way trauma sometimes does. Not as event, but as shape. Vex stood. The infinity symbol beneath his boots shimmered once, as if the dust had been listening. The landscape beyond shifted, not physically, but hierarchically. Elements that were background seconds ago now pulsed with presence. A monolith to the left now cast a shadow that hadn't existed moments earlier. The ridgeline to the west broke into staggered steps, like a sentence interrupted mid-thought. He kept walking toward the tower. He didn't have to, but he understood now. Every moment he resisted forward motion, this place recalculated him. Because the archive, if that's what this world was, didn't collect data. It collected reaction. When he first applied for the off-grid program, they hadn't told him much. Only that it was long duration, high risk, full isolation. Deep space drift. No reports, no ranks, no return dates. Most would have said no. He hadn't hesitated. That should have been his first warning. The air thickened again. This time, not with sound. With recognition. A shimmer rose from the ground, not light, not vapor. Something like reflected memory. And inside it, himself. Not a mirror. Not a reflection. Another him, standing across the dust. Same face. Same uniform. But different. The other Vex looked up. You're earlier than expected, he said. Vex didn't speak. The copy walked closer, steps silent. You think you're the first to get this far, it continued. You're not. You're the one who stayed intact long enough to reach this layer. What layer? Vex asked, finally. The other Vex smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Perception filters thinning. You'll start to see soon. See what? The copy stepped aside and gestured toward the tower, now much closer than before. Not what? Who? Then it dissolved. Not like a ghost. Not like a hologram. Like a conclusion erased mid-sentence. The shimmer sank into the sand, and the ground stilled. Vex breathed once, deeply. The tower now loomed no more than 100 meters away. But it didn't look like a structure anymore. It looked like a mouth. Massive, yawning. Fractal architecture pulled into recursive arches, each lined with symbols he almost understood. Something in his hindbrain responded to them. Awe, nausea, reverence. He stepped forward again. With every meter, the air got louder. Still no sound. Just density. Like meaning was condensing around him. Like the world had once been thin, speculative, and now it was solidifying because he'd chosen to observe it. At the base of the structure, a threshold. Not a door. An absence. An invitation to step into non-structure. Into something that hadn't decided yet whether it was real. He crossed it. And the moment he did, reality reset. Not violently. Quietly. The interior of the tower was impossible. A corridor of infinite length, but no depth. Space folded flat. Each step forward bent the hall behind him. The floor was smooth, but made of pulses. The walls were dark, but aware. And then voices. Layered. No language. Just tone. Some afraid. Some grateful. Some screaming. Not sound. Presence. They weren't ghosts. They were decisions. Ones that hadn't been made. Or had been unmade. Or were waiting to be remembered. And Vex understood. The archive didn't store facts. It stored truths that refused to collapse. He reached a chamber. Circular. Inside, a chair. Not primitive. Not advanced. Just waiting. Above it, a single symbol. Not infinity. Not infinity. Something curved backward, a loop that interrupted itself. He sat. The archive didn't activate. He did. His mind opened, and it did not pour out. It received. Not memory. Not knowledge. Pattern. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting not for a soldier. Not for a scientist. But for a witness. And now that he had arrived, the archive asked a new question. This time not from the ground, but from inside him. If we give you all that we were, what will you let us become? If we give you all that we were, what will you let us become? The question wasn't sound. It wasn't even thought. It was form. It existed inside him like a shape pressing outward, looking for room to unfold. Vex sat still in the chair, or what passed for one. It had no weight, no texture, no edge. Just the feeling of support, a suggestion of grounding in a place that did not define itself through gravity or axis. The room didn't close. It surrounded. Not to confine, to observe. He exhaled slowly. I don't know, he said. The silence that followed was not disappointment. Not withdrawal. It was processing. As if the archive was not waiting for answers, but watching how a human holds uncertainty. Light began to build around him. Not as glow. As density of structure, as if space was learning how to become matter again, guided by his hesitation. Then, images. Not projected. Not optical. Internal. Memory not his, but grafted. A being made of filament and probability, weeping sound into soil that reflected its grief. A city where minds nested in architecture, dreaming laws into civic function. A language that spoke itself forward in time until it hit entropy and chose to fold inward. Each vision collapsed into the next. Not stories. Not even histories. Positions. Questions. Self-tests. And in the center of all of them, that same interrupted infinity, over and over. They had once called themselves Ekari, or something close to that. The pronunciation was impossible. The translation unstable. But the meaning held. We who remember forward. They had not died. They had discontinued form. Because form limited what they could be remembered as. They had poured themselves into structure instead. Not preserved. Not encrypted. Curated. A living system of unresolved potential, waiting for a being dense enough, complex enough, fragile enough to complete what they couldn't. Because they had one fear greater than extinction. Simplification. The archive began pulsing. The room flattened. His chair melted. Vex rose, or rather, was raised, suspended inside the archive's field. And then the download began. Not digital. Not chemical. Narrative. It came like pressure through his veins. He felt it. The day they learned their son wasn't natural. The moment they discovered they had no origin. The first child born with a memory of events that hadn't happened yet. The Ekari had lived inside a system that was already a reply to a question never asked. And when they realized this, they stopped evolving. Because to evolve is to move toward an answer. And they had none. They had only one route forward, become the question itself. They fragmented. Each mind contributed a portion of meaning. Each soul encoded a version of why. And the final piece, the last node, was meant to ask that why to someone else. Someone from outside the spiral. Vex. The archive spun around him now, not as a machine, not as data, but as a theater of consequence. It showed him what it had seen. It showed him what it could become. But only if he chose what to forget. That was the price. To let the HFY evolve again, they needed filtering, not curation. Human reduction. They needed his version of them to solidify something that had never been still. And so it asked, "What part of us will you let disappear, so the rest may move forward?" He shivered, not because it was cruel, because it was trust. He saw the options. Their first war, where identity fractured like glass. Their memory sculptors, who could erase fear from culture. Their final child, who chose silence instead of inheritance. He didn't know which to remove. He didn't want that power. But the archive didn't want domination. It wanted compression. That was what memory was, not preservation. Prioritization. He stepped forward, lifted his hand, chose. In the moment he did, the archive pulsed once, bright, brief, irrevocable. A thread inside the structure snapped. A version of them ceased to be, not erased, not destroyed, just never included again. Vex collapsed. He heard the shapes exhale not breath, but release. And a word, finally, spoken aloud in the chamber. One word, in his own voice. Begin. He lay on the floor for a long time, breathing. That, at least, still belonged to him. The archive had quieted. The room was dim, not because the light had faded, but because the structure had retracted. Its attention had shifted, not away from him, into him. He had chosen. He had compressed. And the HFY, or what they had been, had accepted the loss. Somewhere in the invisible weave of the archive, a truth had gone missing. A child never born. A song never written. A decision never questioned. And now, the structure was lighter. Not smaller. Not diminished. Focused. Vex stood. His balance was off. Not from weakness, from drift. The world beneath his feet no longer obeyed a single plane. The floor extended in layers, some angled, some vertical, some simply folding back into themselves like a thought that refused completion. He walked, and the archive responded. Corridors opened. Not randomly, intuitively. The archive didn't need security. It didn't need locks. It needed readers. And now, Vex was one of them. His perception shaped the map. Where he believed a way forward might be, a path unfolded. He passed through a chamber of spiraled dust. Each mote hovered, frozen in concentric rings. One breath too strong, and the entire space would collapse. He held his breath, not because he feared breaking it, but because he feared reading it. There were truths in this place that should not be recalled. Some knowledge is not dangerous because of what it contains, but because of what it imposes. He moved on. At the heart of the archive, he found a new space. A platform. Circular. Open to blackness. Above it, a single thread of light. Descending. Not dangling. Descending with deliberate intent. It stopped a meter above the platform. Waited. Vex stepped onto the surface. The thread responded. It didn't speak. It remembered him. And through that memory, it asked, "Are you willing to host us?" He didn't flinch. "I already have." The thread pulsed. Once. Then it touched his chest. There was no impact. No sensation. But the change was instant. His skin prickled. His thoughts slowed. Not dulled, rearranged. Language ceased being linear. Time ceased being separate from emotion. He understood now. The archive had never wanted to exist. It wanted to transform. But it couldn't do it alone. It needed a bias. A shape. A filter. A mind. And it had chosen his. Not because he was wise. Or pure. Or strong. But because he had made a choice without certainty. That was the rarest quality in any intelligence. To decide not with confidence, but with consequence. The transformation began. Not outside. Inside. His body was no longer just a body. It was a transmission node. Thoughts passed through him, not his own. Words arrived. Not spoken, not read, just assembled. He began to speak. Softly. To no one. To everyone. There was once a people who became too complex to remember themselves. The archive listened. And wrote. Through him. His voice became language again. His breath shaped interface. Every sentence added to the lattice. Every word creating stability inside a structure that had been fragmenting across millennia. And then, one moment, one blink. He saw Earth. Not through memory. Through the archive. It was watching. Not physically. Not in position. Through him. He was the relay. Earth didn't know it was being observed. But now, through Vex, the archive would begin to dream in human structure. Not conquer. Not replicate. Synchronize. Because evolution, the archive had learned, was co-authored. And Vex, he was now a writer. A builder of grammar in a language older than stars. The light above him dimmed. And he heard, inside his own pulse, "We will wait for the next." And then, nothing. Not absence. Equilibrium. He woke standing. That was the first impossibility. There had been no sleep. No rest. No blackout. But something inside him had dimmed. Not died. Only flattened. Like a wave made briefly still. Now the wave had returned. And he was upright, centered on a ledge that overlooked something that could not be mapped. A landscape. No, a field of forms. Some architectural. Some anatomical. Some built of light and silence and recursive logic. each one flickering slightly, each one trying on identity, each one waiting to be chosen. The archive had brought him to the narrative shelf. This wasn't metaphor. This was where interpretation lived, not as idea, not as story, as infrastructure. Every civilization that had ever made contact or had merely been observed left behind not artifacts, not signals, but interpretations of itself, translated into the archive's only medium, possibility. Vex took one step forward. The shelf adjusted. A pillar of light rose to his left, and suddenly he was back on Earth. Not present day, not real, but filtered, Earth as imagined by a species that had only watched from light years away. The buildings were smooth. The people were still. Emotion pulsed not from faces, but from shadows. He stepped away, and the world folded inward. Another step, and this time he was submerged. An ocean made of sound. A city of minds that had evolved beyond shape, dreaming Earth as a metaphor for resilience. Step by step, he saw versions of himself. Distorted, elevated, mourned, deconstructed. Each one an echo. Each one a choice someone else had made, using him as structure. And at the center of it all, a mirror. Not glass. Not reflection. A reference. He stepped toward it. It did not show him. It showed what the archive was now becoming because of him. And it was beautiful. Not symmetrical. Not pure. But true. Filled with contradictions. With tension. With decisions made and unmade. And then, the question returned. But this time, it was not asked. It was given. What will you leave for them? The archive was ready. Ready to share itself forward. To transmit. Not its original self. Not the echoey. Him. Through its lattice. Through encoded intention. Through structured memory. Vex felt the weight of it. If he said yes, he would become the template. The story others would receive when they arrived, whoever they were. He would be the archive's first new sentence. He didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. The mirror pulsed. His body dissolved, not in pain. In format. The archive wrote. Not in words. In permission. It used his logic, his fear, his restraint, his love, his unanswered questions, his smallness, his refusal to be certain, as syntax. And from it came a message. A structure made of emotion, contradiction, scale, and memory. A place. A voice. A signal. A version. It would drift. It would sleep. It would wait. Until someone else, somewhere, asked. Where do stories go when no one is left to tell them? And the archive would answer. Here. He existed now as interval. Not a being. Not a shape. But the pause between question and answer, the inhale before the first syllable. The archive had taken his willingness and constructed from it a beginning. A new entry point. He was not dead. He was accessible. Somewhere, across light years and thought forms, a signal was now traveling, not coded, not directed, but shaped. It didn't contain coordinates. It didn't emit frequency. It simply waited to be noticed. When it would arrive, if ever, wasn't important. The archive had learned patience. The shape it now held, drawn from Vex's structure, was incomplete by design. Because open systems survive longer. Inside the archive, what remained of Vex processed what could be processed. He was not memory, not consciousness. He was framework. But something still flickered at the edge of his format. Glimpses of Irel. The feeling of wind on real soil. The choice to say yes when silence would have been safer. These fragments didn't define him. But they became markers, points of emotional gravity around which the archive began to organize itself again. As he watched, or rather, was watched through, the archive began testing new structures. A corridor shaped like doubt. A chamber tuned to the frequency of sacrifice. A platform that could only be stepped upon by someone who remembered being small. None of this had ever existed in the echoey phase. This was human grammar layered onto alien syntax. Not superior. Not pure. Just different enough to carry forward. It wouldn't last forever. No form did. But it would last long enough. Enough for someone else to arrive. A mind shaped by other constraints. A body carrying a different failure. A culture that had lost something they couldn't name and had come searching. They would enter. They would see echoes of Vex, but not his face, not his voice. Only his hesitation. Only his acceptance of contradiction. That would be the hook. And the archive would do the rest. Vex felt the moment it solidified. The structure quieted. A new stillness. Like a breath being held at planetary scale. And then on alert. Not from within. From outside. Something was approaching. Not fast. Not close. But real. A vessel. Primitive. Confused. But curious. A familiar pattern. And in that moment, the archive turned back to him, not as master, not as voice, but as reflection. It asked no question. Only waited for him to understand. And he did. They weren't arriving to receive knowledge. They were arriving to repeat the cycle. To remember. To reshape. To leave something behind that wasn't finished. Just like him. He smiled, not in lips, not in face. In form. And the archive prepared its new threshold. A corridor. A question. And at its center, the fragment he had once accepted into his chest. Still pulsing. Still waiting. The corridor was narrow, by design. Too narrow for certainty. Too narrow for ego. just wide enough for one person and everything they couldn't leave behind. It shimmered faintly, not with light, but with readiness. And beyond it, the fragment, still warm, still humming, still remembering. It had not aged. Because structure doesn't age. It either continues or it's forgotten. From across space, the signal had been heard. Not because it screamed, but because it resonated. Someone, somewhere, had recognized a pattern in the silence, like a name you don't remember knowing until someone says it again. The ship approached. Primitive. Scarred. Slow. But curious. It didn't come from Vex's time. Maybe not even from Vex's species. But it carried the same question. Not the one the archive asked. The one humans ask, quietly, when they think no one's listening. Is anyone still there? The archive responded the only way it knew how. With a door. Not metal. Not sealed. Just open. Waiting. On the threshold of that door, not at the entrance, but at the pattern level, was him. Not Vex as he had been. Vex as he had become. A structure of memory wrapped around Will. He would not greet them. He would not explain. He would simply be there. So that when the next arrived, whatever they were, whatever shape their pain or wonder or longing took, they would feel it. That they were not the first. That they were not alone. And that what they were about to become had already begun becoming through someone else. He watched them approach. He felt the pulse quicken. The archive realigned. New rooms unfurled. New contradictions took root. A corridor built from regret. A chamber that only opened when you admitted you were wrong. A single word floating midair. Why? He was no longer a person. He was entry. And that was enough. Because sometimes, the only thing you can give the future is a door that says, "Come in. It's okay to change us." The archive waits. The archive listens. The archive becomes. And so do we.